Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, who is the more expert in setting a clear, transparent and neutral referendum question, the Electoral Commission or Mike Russell?
First Minister.
Well, the Electoral Commission.
Although I'm not entirely sure why any question posed in a hypothetical future referendum should be subject to testing and scrutiny, if the mere reason for it is to achieve so-called confidence and assurance for voters. That said, the idea that this question has already been tested and therefore should be identical to the one of 2014 is where I fundamentally disagree. As the referendum in 2014 was to, in effect, go it alone, and albeit the SNP had intentions to attempt to rejoin Europe, until that process had occurred, if at all, Scotland would have, in effect, been truly independent. The referendum that the SNP sporadically bring up on the days they're not trying to stop Brexit completely, however, is predicated on remaining or rejoining Europe in the event of being dragged out against our will, quote-unquote. And this doubling down in regards to the question being tested, claiming the referendum is identical to 2014's, gives off the impression that they're quite prepared to dupe people into thinking that it's merely a rerun of 2014. And it's not. It's nowhere near it.
Electoral Commission, I would say, because the Electoral Commission did do it for the question that would be proposed for a future independence referendum. I don't know anybody across Scotland, with the exception of politicians who seem to be running scared of the verdict of the Scottish people when that question is asked again. I don't know anybody who thinks that that question is anything other than clear and understandable. But I'm going to take today's question from Richard Leonard as progress, because in asking me about the question for an independence referendum, he now appears to be accepting that an independence referendum is inevitable. So that's progress.
And despite all the myriad of cheers, I don't get it. I mean, last Thursday in Germany, in an interview for DW News, Helmut Head said clear as day any referendum would come in the event of the UK leaving Europe. And taking into consideration that the SNP have played an integral role in making the ability of leaving as difficult as possible, if near enough impossible, I fail to see where this inevitable referendum comes into effect. You're surely not relying on the referendum bill.
It's not just politicians who are saying this. Clear, transparent and neutral is not my expression. It is the considered view of Dame Sue Bruce, the Electoral Commissioner for Scotland. She told the Finance and Constitution Committee of this Parliament, and I quote, "We strongly believe that the Electoral Commission should be asked to test the question." She argued this on the grounds of, and I quote, "the integrity of the process," to establish that the question is clear, transparent and neutral in its setting. First Minister, why are you prepared to disregard those principles?
First Minister.
The question was tested by the Electoral Commission, and more than that, the question was tested in the reality of a referendum. And I don't know anybody in Scotland, with the exception of the Tories and their friends in the Labour Party, who say anything other than that question was clear, understandable, comprehensible and completely transparent.
Well, we're being treated to yet another example of the short memory lapses that the SNP seemingly share cross-party amongst themselves, as they're all in agreement that the referendum of 2014 was simple and understandable, therefore could be simply repeated, when it's them who spent the majority of their time bullshitting about the outcome of said referendum, with the claims of so many supposedly voting to remain last time round, as they'd been led to believe that that was the only way to secure remaining within the European Union. So they've chosen to rewrite history in effect, to completely dupe the public and the wider world, and have to their credit been somewhat successful. But I don't understand how the referendum of 2014 could have been simple or easy to understand if, by their own admission, so many seem to misunderstand where the European Union was to fit into all of this. And of course, That government overhaul of the education must be paying dividends if they're able to dupe people with this fucking nonsense. Surely not. I mean, taking them at their word for a moment, they all love to claim that they've got a mandate that can be acted upon anytime they want. So hypothetically speaking, of course, if that were to be true, then presumably that would mean that the so-called circumstantial changes that would need to occur, the same changes that would need to occur in the real world, not helmet heads, warped imagination. Nonetheless, digression. Presumably taking them at their word in regards to them having their mandate, that would mean circumstantial changes would have occurred, and therefore that would mean that the case for the referendum this time round and the circumstances regarding the referendum would be different by default to that of 2014. Surely, because by your own admission, circumstances have changed. Suppose that could be considered nitpicking, but hey-ho.
Exception of the Tories and their friends in the Labour Party who say anything other than that question was clear, understandable, comprehensible and completely transparent. It seems to me that Labour and the Tories have now realised that they're not going to be able to block the right of the Scottish people to choose their own future, so they're now wondering...
Here we go again, with the Scotland's right to determine Scotland's future routine. Doesn't get old, does it? It's a baseless soundbite, bordering on disingenuous in all seriousness. Has the mandate, which could lead to a referendum, hypothetically, down the line, is more likely to be blocked by their own actions, rather than the coup, potentially, of a Tory and Labour coalition. Considering their mandate's predicated on Brexit occurring, and it was initially brought about into public discourse because at the time there was an understanding that Brexit was to supposedly occur one day. Yet as the months have rolled on, these staunch Remainers in Westminster have done everything in their power to fuck up Brexit, and of course if an extension ends up occurring in the foreseeable future as a result of, will be no further forwards, and that will include the SNP with their claims of determining their future. Our rights, our future.
How they can rig the whole process. Well, I've got news for Richard Leonard. The people of Scotland will get the chance to choose a better future than Tory Brexit Britain.
And Tory Brexit Britain. What is Tory Brexit Britain? Well, they've effectively blocked no deal. They've got a minority Tory government by the balls, refusing any general elections, counting down the clock to make sure that no deal can't occur. They all hope to force through an extension, paving the way for a second referendum, which will inevitably lead to remaining if the question was set around the basis of Theresa May's deal or Remain. And any deal that Boris Johnson is able to come back with, and I say deal lightly, ain't going to be much different from the one that Theresa May provided. So unless a miracle occurs in the foreseeable future that nobody's seen coming, it's safe to assume that the Tory Brexit Britain that they refer to isn't going to happen, therefore rendering that pledge near enough redundant.
Richard Leonard, if he now accepts that it is right to allow the people of Scotland to choose their own future in an independence referendum, then I welcome that, and then let's have the discussions about the detail, and then let's go on to the substance of that argument.
Presiding Officer, the people of Scotland chose their future 5 years ago. The electoral...
He's not wrong.
Well, let me try again. Let me try again with what the Electoral Commission has said. Because the Electoral Commission is clear that the question needs to be tested. And they say, and I quote them...
I don't know about the question, as I said before, but the circumstances and the scenario regarding the question really need to be highlighted a bit more, talked about in a bit more detail, as this complete and utter misleading notion that it's all about independence and the lack of effort on display to correct people, to crystallise the direction that they intend to take if independence was to occur. It seems that they're holding back to a degree when it comes to any clarification.
Regardless of whether the Commission has previously published views on the question proposed. So you are ignoring the Electoral Commission, but you are also ignoring the Law Society of Scotland. In its evidence to Parliament, the Law Society argues that your approach, and I quote, precludes the Commission from scrutinising the question. And they say that means that the referendum question would avoid, and I quote them, the level of scrutiny and accountability which should be applied to important questions which may affect the whole of Scotland. So this is not just about the integrity of this process, this is about the integrity of your government. The Electoral Commission and the Law Society both say that this is the wrong approach, so why don't you listen to them? What have you got to hide? Or are you simply trying to rig the process?
First Minister.
Presiding officer, I have to be honest here. I am really struggling to keep up with Richard Leonard's twists and turns here. If I'm understanding him right, and bear with me here because I know this is a bit complicated, Richard Leonard is standing up here today demanding that we test a question again for a referendum that he also says shouldn't happen and he's not going to allow to happen. That's the first inconsistency and contradiction in Richard Leonard's position. Then he says the people of Scotland shouldn't have the right to have a referendum at all because we chose our future 5 years ago. The people of the UK voted on Brexit 3 years ago, but Richard Leonard supports a second Brexit referendum for the whole of the UK.
And you claim to want independence first and foremost. You claim to want independence above all else. You claim that independence is the #1 priority, but yet you spent the best part of 3 years trying your damnedest to stop Brexit at every fucking turn, therefore rendering your mandate for an independence referendum null and void. Chopping and changing the story in regards to what you want to see for Scotland in the future. With Monday to Friday all about stopping Brexit while simultaneously allowing Scotland to have a right to choose its own future. And then spend the weekends chatting shit about any unlikely event of Brexit occurring in the future before pressing on for another referendum.
You have missed all that has changed in the 5 years since the independence referendum. When people like him were telling the people of Scotland that the only way to protect their membership of the European Union was to vote against independence.
And as your delegates and yourself are quick to remind us whenever it's brought to your attention that a 2014 independent Scotland would have been out of the European Union, it was your intention, it was the SNP's intention to enter negotiations for us to rejoin the European Union. Hypothetically, in theory, but the point remains the same. How in the utter fuck has this rewritten claim to history become the pivotal argument in regards to justifying a second referendum? Surely, how the fuck is this possible? If the European Union was more of a priority back then over independence, then how the fuck did anybody actually come to vote independence in the first place? Second of all, with David Cameron enlightening us all back then, in the same time frame of 2014, that there was a referendum regarding EU membership 2 years later, and the pledges the SNP made regarding rejoining Europe in the event of independence, safe to assume that Europe wasn't really top of the priority list when it came to people wondering on which way they should vote.
Those promises weren't worth the paper they were written on. It's time for Scotland.
It's a promise. It's gone from people thought that the best way to stay within Europe was to vote Remain in 2014. Now it's a promise all of a sudden. And nobody calls them out on it. They just continue to allow their fucking lies to grow arms and legs. Says a lot when your main go-to argument is based on nothing other than shit.
To have the opportunity to choose our future. It is time for Scotland to choose independence.
Join you. You know, it has absolutely nothing to do with independence whatsoever. It's becoming independent from a newly departed United Kingdom from the EU in order to drag us right back into the EU. Not one part of this process would involve independence as a potential long-term goal to pursue. Meanwhile, you exploit nationalism, you exploit patriotism in order to ensure that your EU membership is secured one way or the other. If you can't stop Brexit, you can rely on the dumb fucks who think that you're a nationalist. Global citizenship, sustainable developments, removal of sovereignty, mass migration that you're so hell-bent on ensuring we see. Wow. Then of course the military and security services becoming consumed. Majority votes over the power of vetoes in relation to foreign policy and communism, all courtesy of your fucking cancerous party. Finished off with Scotland losing its place as one of the last somewhat homogenous countries in favour of the progressive, ironically enough, unsustainable dystopia you've all planned for us. And you got the nerve to sit there with your fucking helmet head and talk about independence.